My husband abandoned me at a gas station in the middle of nowhere and thought I'd never be able to do anything about it. But I did. I never thought I'd be one of those women who ends up with a story like this. But here we are. My name is Sloane, and what I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 5 years. 5 years that completely rewired who I am as a person. I should probably start at the beginning, at that gas station in the middle of absolutely nowhere, Colorado, where everything fell apart. It was supposed to be a guys' camping trip. My husband and his 3 buddies had been planning it for months. Some weekend retreat up in the mountains where they could drink beer, tell stupid stories, and pretend they were still in their 20s instead of pushing 40. I wasn't invited, obviously. It was their thing. But the Thursday before they left, my husband suggested I come along for the drive up, stay the first night, and then catch a ride back with one of the guys who had to return early for work. It seemed reasonable at the time. Romantic, even. We'd been married for 12 years, and honestly, things had been rocky. I thought maybe he was making an effort. The drive took about 4 hours. We stopped at this rundown gas station somewhere between nowhere and the middle of nowhere, one of those places that looks like it hasn't been updated since 1970-something, with a flickering neon sign and pumps that groaned when you used them. The bathroom was around back, one of those standalone units with a key attached to a wooden block the size of a dictionary. Classy, right? I remember my husband smiled at me when he handed me the key. Looking back now, I can see it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives you when they know something you don't. But in that moment, I just thought he was being helpful. The bathroom was exactly as disgusting as you'd expect. Cracked mirror, rust stains in the sink, toilet that probably hadn't been properly cleaned since the Carter administration. I did what I needed to do as quickly as possible, washed my hands with soap that barely lathered, and came back out into the cooling desert evening. The parking lot was empty. Not just empty of our car, completely empty. No cars, no people. Nothing but desert scrub stretching out in every direction, and that relentless Colorado wind that makes everything feel even more isolated than it already is. For a moment, I just stood there, key still in my hand, trying to process what I was seeing. At first, I thought they'd pulled around to the front of the building. Maybe they were inside buying snacks or using the actual bathroom. I walked around the entire place twice, my heels clicking on the pavement, calling out my husband's name. The station itself was locked up tight. A handwritten sign on the door said they closed at 8, and it was now almost 9. The parking lot lights hummed overhead, attracting moths that threw crazy shadows across the asphalt. There was literally no one there. I tried calling my husband. The phone rang once, then went straight to voicemail. His voice on the recording, cheerful, casual, made my stomach drop. "Hey, you've reached me. Leave a message." I hung up without saying anything. Tried again. Straight to voicemail. I tried the 3 friends, one after another, my fingers starting to shake as I scrolled through my contacts. Every single phone, straight to voicemail. That's when the panic started setting in. Real physical panic. Heart racing, hands shaking, that metallic taste in your mouth that comes with pure fear. But even then, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe they drove up the road a bit to get better cell service. Maybe one of them got sick and they rushed to find a clinic. Maybe there'd been some kind of emergency. Maybe. I stood in that parking lot for 45 minutes, pacing back and forth, calling and calling and calling. With every minute that passed, the excuses I made for them got weaker and the sick feeling in my stomach got stronger. The temperature was dropping. It gets cold fast in the desert at night, and I only had a light jacket. I hadn't brought my purse. Why would I? I was just going to the bathroom. By the time headlights finally appeared on the horizon, I'd cycled through confusion, denial, anger, and had landed somewhere in the neighborhood of numb terror. A truck finally pulled in around 10. The driver was a woman in her 50s, weathered skin and kind eyes, hauling supplies to Grand Junction. She saw me standing there and immediately knew something was wrong. I must have looked like exactly what I was, someone who'd been abandoned in the middle of nowhere with no idea what to do about it. She asked if I needed help. I started crying before I could even answer. The whole story just poured out of me while we stood under that terrible fluorescent light that kept buzzing and flickering. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I'll never forget. "Honey, that wasn't an accident. That was a choice." I didn't want to believe her. I got in her truck anyway because what else was I going to do? Sleep on the pavement? She drove me all the way to Grand Junction, about an hour and a half, talking the whole time about her own ex-husband and the day she finally left him. She said sometimes the worst thing a person can do is the best thing that could happen to you, and you just don't know it yet. I nodded along, but honestly, I wasn't really processing anything. I was still in shock, still convinced that when I got to Grand Junction, my husband would be there, full of apologies and explanations. He wasn't. The truck driver dropped me off at a 24-hour diner and gave me $40. I tried to refuse it, but she pressed it into my hand and told me to call someone who actually gave a damn about me. I sat in that diner booth for 2 hours with a coffee I didn't drink, trying to figure out who that person was. My parents were the obvious choice. We weren't super close. My husband had always made subtle comments that created distance between us over the years, and I'd been stupid enough to let it happen. But they were still my parents. They'd help. They had to help. I used the diner's phone because my cell was dying and I didn't have a charger. The conversation with my mother is burned into my brain. Sloan. Oh, thank God. Your husband called us. He's been so worried. He said you had some kind of episode and ran off. Are you okay? Where are you? I remember the floor feeling like it disappeared underneath me. What? Mom, no, he left me. He and his friends. They drove away and left me at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. I've been stranded for hours. There was a pause. Then, in this careful voice, she said, Sweetheart, that doesn't make any sense. Why would they do that? Your husband said you'd been acting strange all week. He said you got into a fight and jumped out of the car. He's been calling everyone trying to find you. He'd beaten me to it. He'd actually called my parents first and fed them a completely different version of events. One where I was the unstable one, the unpredictable one, the one who couldn't be trusted. And because he'd been setting this up for years, slowly poisoning the well with comments about how emotional I was, how I overreacted to things, how I could be difficult, they believed him. I tried to explain. I really did. I told her about the bathroom, about all their phones going to voicemail, about the truck driver who helped me. But with every word, I could hear the doubt in her voice growing. My own mother didn't believe me. My father got on the phone at some point and said they thought it would be best if I sorted things out with my husband before coming to them. He actually used those words. Sorted things out. Like I was a child who'd gotten into a fight at school. I hung up. I didn't have the energy to keep trying to convince them. The waitress came over and asked if I wanted a refill. I asked her instead if she knew where the nearest shelter was. That first night in the shelter was probably the loneliest night of my entire life. I lay on a cot that smelled like industrial detergent and listened to other women breathing in the darkness. And I realized something profound and terrible. I had no one. My husband had systematically isolated me over the years, and I'd been too trusting to notice. My family believed him over me. I had no close friends because he'd always had reasons why we couldn't spend time with them. I had no money because our accounts were all joint and I didn't have my debit card. I didn't even have identification because my purse was still in the car. Everything I thought I knew about my life had been left at that gas station along with me. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that parking lot, saw the empty space where the car should have been, heard my own voice calling out their names into the darkness. Around 3 a.m, the woman in the cot next to mine started crying quietly. I wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but I had nothing to give. I was empty. The shelter woke up at 6. Fluorescent lights snapping on, the smell of institutional coffee brewing somewhere down the hall, women shuffling to the bathrooms with their small bags of toiletries. I got up like a zombie and went through the motions, brush teeth, wash face, try to make myself look presentable with the same clothes I'd been wearing for 24 hours. Breakfast was served in a cafeteria-style room. Toast, oatmeal, weak coffee. I sat alone at a table and tried to eat, but everything tasted like cardboard. A woman across from me asked if I was okay. I nodded, unable to speak. If I started talking, I might start screaming. By 8, we all had to be out. That was the rule. The shelter closed during the day, and everyone had to leave until 5 p.m. It made sense, I guess. It encouraged people to look for work, to handle their business, to not treat the shelter like a permanent residence. But for me, it meant 9 hours with nowhere to go. 9 hours to sit in the library and use their computer to search for jobs I couldn't apply for without ID. 9 hours to walk around Grand Junction looking at a city I'd never wanted to live in. 9 hours to think about how spectacularly my life had collapsed. The first week was the hardest. Every morning, I'd tell myself it would get better. Every evening, I'd lie on that cot and realize it hadn't. I called my parents twice more. Once, my mother answered and then claimed it was a bad time and she'd call me back. She never did. The second time, my father answered and told me firmly that they'd decided it was best to give me space to work things out with my husband. Translation, they'd chosen him over me and weren't going to change their minds. On the fourth day, A woman in the shelter had a breakdown. Complete, screaming, sobbing breakdown in the middle of the night. It took 3 staff members to calm her down. We all just lay there in our cots, pretending we couldn't hear it. Each of us probably thinking, that could be me. That probably will be me. On the 5th day, I met the social worker who would change everything. The shelter had a lot of rules. Wake-up time was 6 in the morning, no exceptions. You had to be out by 8 and couldn't come back until 5 in the evening. All personal belongings had to fit in a single provided locker. No alcohol, no drugs, no men in the women's section. The rules made sense, I guess, but they also meant that every single day, I had 9 hours to kill with nowhere to go and nothing to do. An assistant social worker at the shelter, this tired-looking woman in her 30s who'd probably seen 1,000 stories like mine, sat me down on my second morning there and explained my situation in terms I couldn't ignore anymore. Without identification, I was essentially a ghost. I couldn't get a legitimate job, couldn't open a bank account, couldn't rent an apartment or even a room, couldn't prove I was who I said I was. The whole system required paperwork, and all my paperwork was either with my husband or required me to go back to my hometown to obtain. How much does a replacement ID cost? I asked her. Depends on the state, but you're looking at probably $30 to $40 for a basic identification card, maybe more if you need a birth certificate too. And you have to go in person to the vital records office in your county of birth. I had $40 to my name, the same $40 the truck driver had given me. Going back to my hometown meant a bus ticket, which I learned cost $73.50 one way. I didn't have $73.50. I barely had enough for a few meals. She helped me sign up for emergency food assistance, which at least meant I wouldn't starve, and she gave me a list of places that sometimes hired people for cash-based day labor. Under-the-table work. The kind of thing I never thought I'd need to do. But pride is a luxury you can't afford when you're sleeping in a shelter. The cafeteria that hired me wasn't particularly nice. It was one of those places that tries to be trendy, but is really just serving overpriced sandwiches to tourists passing through on their way to the ski resorts. The owner was this sharp-eyed woman in her 60s who looked me up and down when I came in asking about work and said, "You don't look like someone who usually needs under-the-table work." I was honest with her. I didn't have the energy to make up a story. And besides, I was learning that the truth was often stranger than anything I could invent. I told her about the gas station, about my husband, about needing to get to my hometown for identification. She listened without much expression, then said I could wash dishes for $12 an hour, paid daily in cash. No taxes, no paperwork, no trail. It wasn't legal, but neither of us were in positions to be picky about that. So that became my life. 8 to 5, Monday through Saturday, I washed dishes. My hands got raw, and then they got tough. The hot water and harsh soap stripped away whatever softness they'd had. By the end of the first week, I had small cuts on my knuckles that stung whenever I plunged my hands back into the soapy water. By the end of the second week, those cuts had healed into calluses. My body was adapting, even if my mind hadn't caught up yet. I learned to move fast, to anticipate when the lunch rush would hit, to stack plates in a way that maximized space and efficiency. The rhythm of it became almost meditative once I stopped thinking about it. Spray, scrub, rinse, stack, repeat. The other workers were mostly kids, high school and college students picking up extra money. They were nice enough, but there was an obvious divide. They complained about homework and dating drama and whether they'd get the weekend off. I stayed silent, focused on my work, because what was I going to say? That I was 32 years old, sleeping in a shelter, saving for a bus ticket to get identification because my husband had abandoned me at a gas station. Yeah, that would make for great break room conversation. They were there temporarily, for spending money. I was there because it was the difference between sleeping in a shelter and sleeping on the street. Every single day, I got paid. The owner would call me into her office at the end of my shift and count out bills, usually around $90 to $100 depending on how long I'd worked. No receipt, no paper trail, just cash changing hands. Every single day, I took that cash and divided it with the precision of a miser. $20 went into my pocket for immediate needs, food for the 9 hours I couldn't be at the shelter, maybe a cheap pair of socks if the ones I had were getting holes. The rest went into a jar I kept in my locker at the shelter. I'd asked one of the staff if it was safe, and she'd given me this look that said, "Nothing is ever really safe here, but it's the best you've got." So I hid the jar at the bottom of my locker, under the spare clothes and toiletries, and every night I'd count it before I went to sleep. $23, $38, $51, $67. The numbers climbed so slowly it was agonizing. Some days I'd have setbacks. need to buy shampoo, or the zipper on my jacket would break, and I'd have to buy a replacement at the thrift store. Each setback felt like being pushed back down a mountain I was trying to climb. I became obsessed with that jar, with watching the bills slowly accumulate. $73.50 felt like a mountain, impossible to climb, but every day it got a little smaller, a little more attainable. I knew exactly how much I had at any given moment. I could calculate in my head how many more shifts I needed, how many more days of washing dishes, how many more nights in the shelter. The hardest part wasn't the work, it was the isolation. I called my parents 3 more times in those first few weeks. Each conversation went the same way. They insisted I needed to talk to my husband. They said he was worried, that he'd called them crying, asking if they'd heard from me. They said I was making things worse by refusing to communicate with him. They actually used the word refusing, like I was a child having a tantrum instead of an adult who'd been deliberately abandoned by someone who was supposed to love them. The 4th time I called, my father actually said, "Your husband said you'd do this. He said you'd make up stories to make him look bad. He warned us you might try to turn us against him." The fact that he chose to believe, that I was capable of that kind of manipulation, but not that my husband was capable of abandonment, told me everything I needed to know. That's when I stopped calling. There was no point. He'd won the narrative war before I even knew we were fighting, and every time I heard their voices choosing him over me, it hurt in a way that made the gas station abandonment feel almost secondary. 3 weeks into the job, the owner, I should probably give her a name in my head, but I always just thought of her as the owner, started warming up to me. I think she'd been waiting to see if I'd quit or flake out. But when I showed up every single day on time and worked without complaining, something shifted. She started making comments about how I was faster than the kids, how she didn't have to tell me things twice, how I had the kind of work ethic she wished she could find in everyone. One afternoon, during a rare slow period, she called me into her office. I thought I was getting fired, and my heart basically stopped. Instead, she pulled out her purse and counted out $200 in 20s. "That's an advance," she said. "I know you're saving for a bus ticket. This should cover it plus some extra for whatever you need to do when you get there. You can pay me back $20 a week. No interest." I actually started crying right there in her office, which was humiliating, but she just handed me a tissue and told me to pull myself together before the dinner shift. That moment was huge. It was the first time since the gas station that someone had actually helped me without asking what I'd done to deserve my situation. The bus trip back to my hometown took 8 hours. 8 hours of staring out the window at landscape that became increasingly familiar and increasingly painful. I'd grown up here. I'd met my husband here. We'd gotten married in the church 2 blocks from the courthouse, where I'd now need to get my documents. Every mile felt like traveling backward through my own history. I scheduled the whole trip carefully. The bus arrived at 7 in the morning. The vital records office opened at 8. I'd get my identification card and birth certificate, then catch the 4 p.m. bus back to Grand Junction. I'd be gone before anyone who mattered could see me. That was the plan. The courthouse was smaller than I remembered. I filled out the forms with shaking hands. The clerk was this bored-looking woman who processed my request without even looking at my face. 45 minutes later, I had a temporary identification card and a certified copy of my birth certificate. I was legally a person again. I had 5 hours to kill before the bus. I should have stayed in the courthouse or gone to the library or literally anywhere else. But I was hungry, and there was this diner I used to love, and I thought surely I could just sit in a back booth for an hour and no one would notice me. I was wrong. My sister-in-law walked in 20 minutes after I sat down. Not my husband's sister, my brother's wife. I'd forgotten they lived 3 blocks from the diner. She saw me immediately, and her whole face lit up in a way that made my chest hurt. She basically ran over to my booth and slid in across from me without asking. "Where the hell have you been?" she said. "And before you answer, I want you to know that I never believed a single word that piece of garbage told anyone." That's when I learned that my husband had been telling people I'd run off with someone else. Not that I'd had an episode. Not that I'd left in a fight. He'd upgraded his lie to a full-blown affair with an imaginary person. He was telling everyone I'd been sneaking around for months and finally abandoned our marriage for my lover. The story had apparently gotten more elaborate with each retelling. "He filed for divorce last week," she told me. "Abandonment of the marital home. He's trying to get out of giving you anything in the settlement because he's claiming you left voluntarily." I just stared at her. "I don't even want anything from him. I just want him to leave me alone." "Well, that's not what he's doing," she said. "Sloan, there's more. He's been opening credit cards in your name. I saw the mail before. He's got at least 3 that I know of, and they're all maxed out. He's burying you in debt and then planning to claim you did it before you left. I felt like I was going to be sick. The diner sounds, clattering plates, other people's conversations, the hiss of the grill, it all became this overwhelming roar in my ears. I'd been washing dishes for 3 weeks trying to get enough money for a bus ticket, while my husband was actively destroying my financial future. My sister-in-law reached across the table and grabbed my hand. Listen to me. I have a lawyer friend. She does some pro bono work. Let me get you her number. You need to fight this. I made it back to Grand Junction that night with her lawyer friend's number programmed into my dying phone and a completely new understanding of what I was up against. This wasn't just a bad breakup or even a cruel prank. This was systematic. He was trying to make sure that even if I survived leaving, I'd be destroyed in every other way that mattered. The shelter's social worker helped me connect with a legal aid attorney the next week. He was young, overworked, and probably handling 50 cases at once, but he took mine. We filed responses to the divorce, contested the abandonment claim, and started the process of proving the credit card fraud. It was all going to take time. Months, probably. Maybe longer. The debt turned out to be worse than my sister-in-law had thought. It wasn't 3 credit cards. It was 7. 7 different cards, all opened using my social security number, my birth date, and addresses I'd lived at years ago. The total was just over $43,000. $43,000 of charges I never made for things I never bought, and somehow I was on the hook for all of it. My legal aid attorney, I called him by his first name, which was Tom, because calling him my attorney felt too formal for someone working out of an office that was basically a converted storage closet, explained that proving fraud would take time. We'd need police reports, paperwork from the credit card companies, documentation of where I was when the charges were made. It was going to be a long, bureaucratic nightmare, and there was no guarantee we'd win. The collection calls started around the same time. My old phone number started getting hit with automated calls. When I didn't answer, they started calling my parents. My parents, who still believed I'd abandoned my marriage for another man, were now fielding calls from debt collectors looking for me. My mother called me for the first time since that initial night. She didn't ask how I was doing. She asked why I was letting my debts go to collections and embarrassing the family. When I tried to explain that the debts weren't mine, that my husband had opened them fraudulently, she said something that still echoes in my head sometimes. If you'd been a better wife, maybe he wouldn't have felt the need to do any of this. I hung up on her. I didn't yell, didn't cry, just ended the call. Some part of me had still been holding on to this fantasy that eventually they'd see the truth and apologize, and we'd fix our relationship. That phone call killed that fantasy. They'd chosen sides, and they hadn't chosen mine. 8 months after the gas station incident, I was in a very different place than I'd been that first night. I had a room now, not an apartment, just a single room in a house with 4 other tenants. But it was mine. I was working full-time at the cafeteria, and the owner had promoted me to a supervisor position, which came with a legitimate paycheck instead of cash. I'd paid her back the $200 loan. I had my documents. I had a bank account with exactly $912 in it, which felt like a fortune. But I also had a court date approaching for the divorce proceedings, collection agencies calling the shelter as a forwarding address, and the constant low-level anxiety that at any moment, something else would blow up in my face. The cafeteria became my refuge. There's something meditative about repetitive work when your brain is chaos. Wash dishes, prep vegetables, make sandwiches, clean counters, repeat. The owner started teaching me more about the business side, how to do inventory, manage suppliers, handle difficult customers. I think she recognized something in me, some kind of desperate hunger to prove I was worth something. She fed that hunger with responsibility, and I grabbed onto it like a lifeline. It was during this period that he started coming in, the medical student. He'd been a customer before, always ordered the same thing, turkey sandwich on wheat, no mayo, extra tomatoes, black coffee, but I'd never really paid attention to him beyond taking his order. But now he was coming in late at night, after the dinner rush, usually around 9 or 10 p.m. He'd sit at the corner table with textbooks and notes spread everywhere, and he'd study until we closed at 11. At first, I barely noticed him. Just another customer in a long line of customers. But after a few weeks, I started to recognize the pattern. Same time, same table, same order. He'd nod at me when he came in, a quick acknowledgement, then disappear into whatever he was studying. Anatomy, from what I could see when I passed by his table. Detailed diagrams of the human body, medical terminology I couldn't begin to pronounce. It took another 2 weeks before he actually started talking to me beyond his order. It was a slower night, one of those random Tuesdays where the place was dead, and I was wiping down tables near where he sat. He looked up from his textbook and asked if I wanted the leftover coffee since we were just going to throw it out anyway. I said yes because free coffee is free coffee, and I'd learned not to turn down anything free. Then he asked if I wanted to sit for a minute since the place was dead. I said yes to that too, mostly because my feet hurt, and I'd been on them for 9 hours straight. His name was something common. I won't write it here because this isn't really about him. It's about what he represented to me at that moment in my life. He was in his 3rd year of medical school, specializing in emergency medicine. He came to the cafeteria to study because his apartment was loud. Thin walls, neighbors who fought constantly, and the library closed too early for his night owl schedule. We talked for maybe 15 minutes before other customers came in. But it was 15 minutes where I wasn't Sloan who got abandoned, or Sloan who's fighting a divorce, or Sloan who sleeps in a shelter. I was just Sloan, having a conversation about whether studying at night was more effective than studying in the morning, his position, or if it just meant you were more caffeinated than educated, my position. He started staying later. We started talking more. Nothing inappropriate. He'd study, I'd do closing work, and we'd chat during the slow periods. He never asked about my past or why I was working at a cafeteria in my 30s, or any of the questions that would have required me to unpack the previous year of my life. We talked about movies and music and the weird customers we'd both encountered, and whether the universe was infinite or just really, really big. It was the closest thing I'd had to a normal human interaction in months. No pity, no judgment, no complicated history. Just 2 people talking about nothing important. And somehow that made it the most important part of my day. Meanwhile, the lawsuit crept forward with all the speed of continental drift. Tom filed our response, calling it what it was, a frivolous attempt at intimidation. We had a preliminary hearing scheduled for January, which was 3 months away. 3 months of this thing hanging over my head like a sword. My husband's attorney sent a formal demand through Tom. They wanted me to sign away any claim to marital assets, including the house, the cars, the joint savings that I'd contributed to for 12 years in exchange for my husband agreeing not to pursue the debt issue. Basically, I could walk away with nothing and let him keep everything. Or I could fight and risk being held responsible for $43,000 of fraud. Tom asked what I wanted to do. I remember sitting in his cramped office, looking at the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a bird, and feeling this strange calm wash over me. Fight it, I said. All of it. I'm not signing away my life because he's threatening me. Let them take me to court. It's going to get ugly, Tom warned. It's already ugly, I said. At least this way I'm not pretending it isn't. The preliminary divorce hearing happened on a Thursday. I had to take the day off work, which meant losing a day's pay, but there was no way around it. The courthouse was in my hometown, which meant another bus ride into my past. I wore the only professional outfit I'd managed to piece together from the thrift store, a black skirt and a gray blouse that fit okay if I kept the jacket buttoned. I looked like I was going to a funeral. Appropriate, considering I was watching the legal death of my marriage. My husband showed up with his expensive attorney, looking confident and put together in a way that made me want to scream. He'd gained weight since I'd last seen him. Not a lot, but enough to notice. He didn't look at me when he walked in, didn't acknowledge my existence at all. Just sat at his table and whispered with his lawyer like I was furniture. The hearing itself was mostly procedural. Tom had filed our responses contesting the abandonment claim and alleging financial fraud. My husband's attorney argued that I'd left voluntarily and had been unstable for months prior to my departure. They submitted affidavits from his 3 friends backing up his version of events. Tom submitted the messages. The text messages from my husband's friends that my sister-in-law had somehow managed to get screenshots of before they were deleted. Messages from the day of the gas station incident, laughing about the prank, joking about how long I'd wait before figuring out they weren't coming back. Messages that made it very, very clear this had been planned and deliberate. I watched my husband's face when Tom projected those messages on the screen, watched the color drain out of it, watched him lean over to whisper frantically to his attorney. The attorney asked for a brief recess, which the judge granted with this look that suggested she knew exactly what was happening. When we came back, suddenly my husband's team wanted to reconsider the terms and work toward an amicable settlement. Translation? They knew they'd lost the abandonment argument and were scrambling to minimize damage. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s who looked like she'd seen every divorce trick in the book, denied the abandonment claim right there. She also ordered a temporary freeze on any further credit card use in my name and scheduled a follow-up hearing on the fraud allegations. Outside the courthouse, he tried to talk to me, actually followed me to where I was waiting for my bus and tried to have a conversation. His exact words were, "We can still fix this, Sloan. We can work through it. I still love you. I looked at him, really looked at him, and tried to find any trace of the man I'd married 12 years ago. I couldn't. You don't love me, I said. You don't even know what that word means. You love control. You love having someone to manipulate. But love? Actual love? You've never felt that for anyone but yourself. He started to respond, but I turned and walked away. Got on my bus. Didn't look back. 8 months turned into a year, then 2. Time has this weird way of moving both incredibly slowly and terrifyingly fast when you're rebuilding your life from scratch. The legal battle with my ex-husband dragged on through continuances and paperwork and more court dates than I'd ever imagined possible. But other things were changing. Good things. I'd been promoted again at the cafeteria, this time to assistant manager. Real salary, benefits, the whole package. I'd moved out of the room rental situation and into a small studio apartment that was technically too expensive for my budget, but felt like a palace after the shelter and the shared house. I had furniture from thrift stores and a mattress I'd bought new because I'd decided that if there was one thing I deserved after everything, it was a bed that no one else had slept in first. The owner of the cafeteria, her name was June, and I'd finally started using it, had started talking about retiring. She was 68 and tired, and her kids had no interest in taking over the business. She hadn't said anything explicitly, but I got the sense she was testing me, seeing if I could handle more responsibility. I was working 14-hour days sometimes, covering for sick employees, dealing with suppliers, basically running the place while she took longer and longer vacations to visit her daughter in California. Then the new lawsuit came. My ex-husband, his attorney technically, but same difference, filed a civil suit against me for defamation and emotional distress. The claim was that I'd spread malicious lies about him that had damaged his reputation and caused him significant psychological harm. They were asking for $75,000 in damages. Tom called me at work to tell me about it. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it was so overwhelming that laughing was the only possible response. The man who'd orchestrated my abandonment, committed fraud in my name, and spent 2 years lying to everyone we knew was now claiming that I was the one who damaged his reputation. It's a pressure tactic, Tom explained. He's hoping you'll agree to a settlement in the divorce just to make this go away. The defamation case has almost no merit. Truth is an absolute defense. And we have those text messages. But he knows that defending yourself costs money and energy. June had been in the hospital the week before for some kind of heart issue. Minor, she'd insisted, but scary enough that she'd started talking seriously about selling the cafeteria. She'd even floated the idea to me, in her casual way, asking if I'd ever thought about owning my own business. I had thought about it. Constantly. But thinking about something and having $50,000 for a down payment are two very different things. And now, with this new lawsuit looming, the idea of taking on debt for a business purchase felt impossibly risky. The medical student had become a regular fixture in my life by then. We'd moved from casual conversations to actually hanging out outside the cafeteria. Nothing romantic at first, just two people who'd become friends. But there was something there, something that made my life feel less like survival and more like living. The hearing for the defamation lawsuit was scheduled for a Wednesday in February, which meant another trip back to my hometown, another day away from work, another bus ride through landscape that I'd come to associate with dread. But this time felt different. I wasn't going as someone who'd been abandoned and was trying to survive. I was going as someone who'd survived and was now fighting back. Tom met me at the courthouse steps. We'd prepared extensively for this. He'd drilled me on possible questions, walked me through what to expect, warned me that my ex-husband's attorney would try to make me look unstable or vindictive. My ex-husband looked different. Older, obviously, but there was something else. A kind of desperation in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He'd lost the cocky confidence he'd had at the first hearing. He looked like someone who was losing and knew it. His attorney was new. The expensive one from before had apparently dropped him, probably when the bills went unpaid. This guy was cheaper but scrappier, the kind who'd argue anything for anyone if the check cleared. He opened with the argument that I'd been systematically destroying my ex-husband's reputation in our community, telling people he'd abandoned me, when in reality, we'd had a mutual separation. Tom stood up for our response, and it was like watching someone calmly dismantle a house of cards. He presented the text messages again, had them entered as evidence, showed the timestamps, showed the content, showed the clear and unambiguous proof that the abandonment had been planned and deliberate. Then he did something I hadn't expected. He called my sister-in-law as a witness. She'd driven up from her home specifically for this. Took time off work, arranged childcare, the whole thing, and she didn't hold back. She testified about the lies my ex-husband had spread, about the credit card fraud, about his attempts to isolate me from my family. She had receipts, actual screenshots and emails, and even a recording of a conversation where he'd bragged to my brother about teaching me a lesson. She'd been documenting everything for years, apparently, waiting for this moment, waiting for the chance to tell the truth in a place where it mattered. I watched my ex-husband's attorney scramble. He tried to object on various grounds: hearsay, relevance, prejudicial, but the judge shut him down every time. The evidence was solid, the pattern was clear. There was no amount of legal maneuvering that could change the fundamental facts of what had happened. Then Tom called me to the stand. I'd been dreading this part, having to sit up there and recount the worst experience of my life while my ex-husband watched, having to answer questions about my emotional state, my decision-making, my marriage, having to defend my reaction to being abandoned like somehow I was the one who needed to justify my behavior. But when I actually sat down and took the oath, something shifted. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. Tom asked me to describe what happened the night of the gas station incident. I did, in clear detail. Every moment from when my husband handed me that bathroom key to when the truck driver dropped me off at the diner. He asked about the debt. I explained how I'd discovered it, how I'd fought it, how I'd eventually gotten most of it dismissed as fraudulent, but how it had destroyed my credit and taken years to rebuild. He asked about the damage to my reputation. I talked about losing contact with my family, about the rumors that followed me, about starting over in a city where no one knew me because staying anywhere near my hometown had become unbearable. The opposing attorney's cross-examination was exactly what Tom had warned me about. He tried to paint me as bitter and vengeful, someone who'd refused reasonable settlement offers because I wanted to punish my ex-husband. He asked why I'd moved to a different city if I had nothing to hide. He asked if I'd been faithful during the marriage. Yes, and if I could prove it. How exactly does one prove a negative? He tried to make me lose my temper, tried to get me to say something emotional and rash that would support their narrative of an unstable, vindictive ex-wife. I didn't give him the satisfaction. Every question I answered calmly and directly. When he asked why I'd refused to work things out with my husband, I looked at the judge and said, because a person who would deliberately abandon their spouse at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, then commit fraud in their name, then sue them for speaking the truth about it isn't someone you work things out with. That's someone you get away from as quickly as possible. The judge called a recess after that. 30 minutes. Tom and I went to the hallway, and he told me I'd done well, that I'd come across as credible and sympathetic without being emotional. I felt numb more than anything. Saying all of it out loud, in an official capacity, with my ex-husband sitting there watching, had been more exhausting than I'd anticipated. When we reconvened, the judge didn't waste time. He'd clearly made up his mind during the recess. He called the defamation case frivolous and without merit, and dismissed it with prejudice, which meant it couldn't be filed again. He also ordered my ex-husband to pay court costs, both his own and mine, and sanctioned his attorney for bringing a case that was clearly meant to harass rather than seek legitimate legal remedy. The words he used were vexatious litigation, and he was clearly annoyed at having his time wasted with such an obviously baseless claim. Then he did something even better. He issued a final order on the divorce right there, without waiting for the scheduled hearing. I got half of the marital assets like I should have from the beginning. My ex-husband was responsible for his own debts, all of them. The credit card fraud was acknowledged in the record, and there was a restraining order included that prohibited him from contacting me except through attorneys, and only for legitimate legal purposes. It was more than I'd hoped for. It was everything. I'd won, completely and totally won. Outside the courthouse, my ex-husband did the last thing I expected. He tried one more time, caught me walking to the bus stop and followed me, talking rapidly, desperately, saying he'd made mistakes, saying he still loved me, saying we could start over. I stopped walking and turned to look at him. Really look at him. He was crying, actual tears running down his face, and I felt nothing. You don't love me, I said. You love what I represented. Someone who you could control. Someone who wouldn't fight back. But I'm not that person anymore. Sloan, please. No, I said. You know what the worst part is? It's not what you did. It's that you think you deserve forgiveness for it. That you think crying and saying you love me erases abandonment and fraud and 2 years of legal harassment. It doesn't. And I don't forgive you. Not because I'm bitter, but because you don't deserve it. I turned and walked away, and got on my bus, and I knew it was the last time I'd see him. On the bus ride back to Grand Junction, I called June, told her I wanted to move forward with the business purchase, told her I'd talked to the bank and they were willing to work with me, told her I was ready to take the risk. She laughed. Actually laughed. I was wondering when you'd stop being scared, she said. Welcome to ownership, kid. 3 years is enough time for a lot of things to change. Enough time to buy a business, learn to run it properly, make it profitable. The cafeteria was mine. Fully mine. I'd signed the papers 14 months after that courthouse victory, with a loan that terrified me and June's promise that she'd consult for the first 6 months. I'd made changes. Updated the menu, renovated the bathrooms, built a small patio area outside for the summer months. Business had grown by 30% in the first year alone. I'd hired 6 employees, real staff with benefits and everything. I'd even started looking at a second location, and I had someone in my life. The medical student wasn't a student anymore. He'd finished his residency and was now an actual emergency room physician at the county hospital. We'd been officially together for 2 years, living together for 8 months. It had been slow and careful, both of us damaged in our own ways. But it worked. We worked. Then my mother showed up. I was busy helping a new employee learn the register when I looked up and saw her standing in the doorway, older and smaller than I remembered, looking uncertain in a way that my mother never looked. She waited until I acknowledged her. Didn't approach, didn't wave, just stood there like she was afraid I'd throw her out. "Can we talk?" she asked when I finally walked over. I looked at the lunch rush building, at my employees managing everything competently without me. "I have 15 minutes, I said. Outside. The patio was empty, too cold for most people. We sat at opposite ends of a table, neither of us quite looking at each other. "I divorced your father," she said. No preamble, no small talk. 8 months ago, the papers finalized in July. I didn't say anything, just waited. He still believes him, your ex-husband, still thinks you abandoned your marriage for another man, that you're lying about everything that happened. I told him about the court case, about the judge's ruling, about the evidence. He won't accept it. Says the system is biased against men." She paused. "I couldn't stay married to someone who'd rather believe a liar than his own daughter." "But you did," I said. "For 3 years you believed the liar." "I did." She looked down at her hands. "I don't have an excuse for that. I was a coward. I'd spent 35 years letting your father make decisions, shape reality, decide what was true. And when you called that night, I was scared." "Why are you here?" I asked. "After 3 years. Why now?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I need help. The divorce. Your father fought everything. He got to keep the house because my name wasn't on it. I have some savings, but not enough for first and last month's rent anywhere decent. I'm staying with your sister-in-law right now, but I can't do that forever. And I hoped, there it was. The real reason. You want money. I want to reconnect with my daughter," she said. "But yes, I also need help. I know I don't deserve it. I know I failed you when you needed me most. But I'm asking anyway because I don't know what else to do." I looked at her, saw the gray in her hair that hadn't been there 3 years ago, saw the way her clothes hung a little loose, saw the desperation that I recognized from my own mirror in those early months, and I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no satisfaction, just emptiness. "I need to think about this," I said. "Of course. I understand. I'm staying with your sister-in-law for another week. You have her number." She stood to leave, got halfway to the door before turning back. "Sloan? I am sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I understand what I did. And I'm sorry." I nodded, watched her leave. That night, I talked to my partner about it. He'd met my mother once, years ago at a family gathering before everything fell apart, but he didn't really know her. What he knew was me, knew what her abandonment had done. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. "Part of me wants to help her just to prove I'm better than she was. But another part thinks that's exactly the kind of thinking that got me into trouble in the first place. Those aren't mutually exclusive," he said. "You can help her and protect yourself. Set boundaries. Make it conditional." I thought about that for days. Eventually, I came to a decision. I called my mother and asked her to meet me at the cafeteria again. Same table on the patio, colder this time because it was late September. I'd brought 2 coffees, set one in front of her. "I'll help you," I said. "I'll pay your rent for 6 months. That should give you time to find work, to get stable. But I have conditions." She nodded, relief washing over her face. "First, you don't get to be my mom right now. You get to be someone I'm helping. We're not doing family dinners and phone calls and pretending the last 3 years didn't happen. Maybe eventually if you prove you've actually changed, but not now. Okay. Second, you go to therapy. Real therapy, not church counseling. You need to figure out why you were willing to abandon your daughter to protect your marriage. Okay. Third, if you ever suggest that I had any responsibility for what happened with my ex-husband, or try to minimize what he did, or make excuses for him or for Dad, we're done. Permanently. No second chances. I understand. And fourth, you're paying me back. Not the money. I don't care about the money. But you're going to tell everyone who ever believed his lies what actually happened. Everyone. I want my reputation back. She flinched at that one. Your father won't. I don't care what Dad does or doesn't do. I care what you do. You helped destroy my reputation by staying silent. You can help rebuild it by telling the truth. There was a long silence. Then she nodded. Okay. All of it. I'll do all of it. I didn't feel victorious or satisfied. I felt tired. But I also knew that if I didn't help her, I'd regret it. Not because of what it would mean about her, but because of what it would mean about me. I wrote her a check that day for 6 months' rent at a modest apartment. Set her up with contact information for the therapist I'd been seeing. Made it clear that this was a business transaction with clear terms, not a reconciliation. She took it all. Signed up for therapy. Found an apartment. Got a part-time job at a department store. And slowly, painfully slowly, started the work. 5 years is a lifetime. 5 years after that gas station in the Colorado desert. I was 33 years old, married to the man who'd been the medical student, 4 months pregnant with my first child, and managing 2 cafeterias. The second location had opened 8 months earlier in a different part of Grand Junction, and it was doing even better than the first. I had 12 employees across both places. I had a house, an actual house with a yard and a mortgage, and neighbors who waved when they saw me. I had equity and retirement accounts and college funds already started for a child who hadn't even been born yet. I had a life that bore absolutely no resemblance to the one I'd had 5 years earlier. Sometimes I'd catch myself in a moment of absolute normalcy, loading the dishwasher, or reviewing inventory spreadsheets, or picking out paint colors for the nursery. And I'd have this flash of memory. That parking lot. That empty, dark parking lot. The feeling of standing there in the cold, calling and no one answering. And then I'd blink, and I'd be back in my kitchen, or my office, or the paint store, and the contrast would be so stark it almost felt like those two people, the woman at the gas station and the woman I'd become, couldn't possibly be the same person. But they were, and I carried both of them with me every day. My mother and I had a relationship now. Not the relationship she probably wanted. We weren't close, we didn't talk every day, we didn't have that mother-daughter bond that she'd maybe hoped to rebuild. But we had dinner once a month, usually at a restaurant halfway between our places. She'd followed through on every condition I'd set. Stayed in therapy for over 2 years before her therapist said she'd done enough work that she could move to maintenance mode. Told people the truth about what had happened, which I knew had cost her socially. Some of the people who'd believed my ex-husband's lies didn't want to hear they'd been wrong. Paid me back the rent money even though I'd told her multiple times she didn't need to, insisted it was important for her own self-respect. She'd even gotten a full-time job at the department store and had been promoted to assistant manager. She was trying. It wasn't enough to erase 3 years of choosing to believe a lie over her own daughter, but it was something. We'd probably never be close. There was too much damage, too much history, but we were civil, we were cordial, we were making the best of a situation that neither of us had chosen. And honestly, that felt like enough. I didn't need her to be the mother I'd always wanted. I just needed her to be someone who acknowledged the truth and tried to do better. She was doing that, and I could respect the effort even if I couldn't fully forgive the past. One evening in early March, I was closing up the original cafeteria, the one where everything had started, where I'd first washed dishes for cash and met the man who'd become my husband. It was a slow night. My manager had handled most of the work, and I was just doing final checks before locking up. My phone rang. It was my sister-in-law. "Hey," she said. "I'm probably being paranoid, but I thought you should know. I ran into someone who knows your ex, and apparently he's been asking around about you. Wants to know where you work, where you live, if you're married. The restraining order expired 2 years ago, so legally he can reach out, but I wanted to give you a heads up in case he tries anything." I felt my heart rate pick up for just a second. That old panic response, that muscle memory of fear. But then I looked around at my cafeteria, my employees cleaning up, my registers being balanced, my business that I'd built from nothing, and the fear evaporated. "Do you want me to tell him anything?" she asked. Or tell him to leave you alone? I thought about it, about all the ways I could respond. All the things I could say, all the ways I could let him know that I'd built something real and substantial and good out of the wreckage he'd tried to bury me in. I could tell him about the cafeterias, about the house, about the marriage, about the baby on the way. I could send him a message through mutual acquaintances about how spectacularly I'd succeeded despite his best efforts to destroy me. But you know what? That would mean I was still thinking about him, still measuring my success against his failure, still letting him occupy space in my head that I'd rather fill with literally anything else. No, I said. Don't tell him anything. Let him wonder. Because that was the truth of it. He'd become irrelevant. Not through any grand confrontation or dramatic final showdown. Not through revenge or proof or showing him that he'd been wrong about me. Just through time and work and the simple act of choosing to build something instead of staying buried in what he'd tried to do to me. I finished locking up and drove home to my husband, who was making dinner because I'd mentioned being tired lately with the pregnancy. We ate on our porch even though it was a bit chilly, because we just had the porch built and I loved it too much not to use it. We talked about names for the baby. He wanted something traditional, I wanted something unusual. We'd been having this debate for weeks and still hadn't landed anywhere. You okay? He asked at one point. He always knew when something was on my mind. Yeah, I said, and I meant it. I'm okay. More than okay, actually. I'm good. Our daughter kicked, strong enough that he could feel it through my belly when he put his hand there. We both laughed. This little person who'd never know the woman I'd been 5 years ago at that gas station, who'd never know what it felt like to have absolutely nothing and no one, who'd grow up in a house with parents who loved each other and a mother who owned her own business, and a life where abandonment was just a word in the dictionary, not a lived experience that shaped everything that came after. That night, after my husband had fallen asleep, I lay awake for a while thinking about those 5 years. About the truck driver who'd given me $40 and a ride to Grand Junction. About June, who'd given me a chance when I had no credentials and no references. About Tom, who'd fought for me when I had no money to pay him properly. About my sister-in-law, who'd believed me when my own parents hadn't. About the medical student who'd become my husband, who'd never once asked me to be anyone other than who I was. I'd spent so much time in those early months thinking about what had been taken from me. My marriage, my family, my reputation, my financial security, everything. I'd been left with nothing but $40 and the clothes I was wearing. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped thinking about what I'd lost and started thinking about what I was building. And what I'd built, slowly, painfully, one day at a time, was better than anything I'd had before. More honest, more mine, more real. 5 years, one gas station, one choice to keep going when everything said to give up. One choice that I made every single day for months, then years, until it wasn't even a choice anymore. It was just who I'd become. And a life that was entirely, irrevocably mine. Irrevocably mine.